for July 11th, 2001, Biography with Harry Smith.
Dame Edna Everage, the bespectacled grande dame of comedy, hailed as the funniest woman in the world. Barry Humphries, Edna's nemesis and manager. Strangely enough, the two have never been seen together. Welcome again to Outrageous Performers Week, and our look at a performer whose outrageousness has made him a sensation. Back in the 1950s, Australian actor Barry Humphries created a character he named Mrs. Norman Everage, later known as Dame Edna. She's the fuchsia-haired suburban housewife turned megastar, an established legend in Australia, England, and most of the English-speaking world. Now Barry Humphries and his alter ego are conquering America, eliciting howls of laughter and glowing reviews at every stop. And if you've never seen Dame Edna in action, you'll soon understand her appeal. And if you're thinking he's just another guy dressed up in women's clothing, think again.
I'm an Australian, and I'm a very, very proud Australian. I think I'm probably the most highly profiled Australian on the planet.
He's never more himself than when he's being somebody else.
He enjoys her eccentricity, he enjoys her snappiness, he enjoys her extremes, and most of all, he enjoys her ability to entertain people and make them laugh.
There aren't many people who could do this, who can do one-man shows, make people think about it. He's not acting out a part that someone's written for him. He is really, you know, the original article.
Where do I go from here? Sainthood has been suggested.
In the mid-1930s, Melbourne, Australia, was a large conservative city of stately Victorian architecture, surrounded by comfortable, well-manicured middle-class suburbs. It was into one of these serene garden suburbs that John Barry Humphries was born, the first of 4 children to Eric and Louisa Humphries on February 17, 1934. It wasn't long before Eric and Louisa realized the son they called Barry was no ordinary child.
I think he was a delight to them. As a small baby, I think they were amazed at him. And at 10 months he started to talk, and by 18 months he was entertaining the grandparents. They'd ring up and say, "We're having visitors, bring him up." And he'd be there in his playpen, singing songs and generally entertaining them.
Barry continued to entertain as he grew. An intelligent and gifted child, he loved to perform in costume at family gatherings. Barry's father, Eric, was an architect and builder who designed many of the homes typical of the time.
I always found him a jovial character. He had a nickname for everybody. Possum was one of them. That was a great favorite of his. We're all possums at one stage or another.
Barry's mother, Louisa, was a former milliner. She was a somewhat disapproving woman who insisted on order and high standards.
I think they instilled in us good behaviour, good table manners. There were certain ways of behaving, and we knew what they were.
Soon the family began to prosper. Though the Humphries were abstemious and church-going themselves, they indulged their precocious firstborn son.
They're, you know, a very doting family. Barry got anything he wanted. If he showed a passing interest in chemistry, his father would build a chemistry lab at the back of the house. If Barry showed a passing interest in shopkeeping, his father would build him a shop.
As a young child, Barry attended Camberwell Grammar School. There, his teachers encouraged his natural talent in art, and he flourished.
He was shy, but academically he was way beyond his age group. His illustrations of his historical notes and things were absolutely realistic. You could see the agony on their faces as they died in battle.
Barry was happy at Camberwell Grammar, but his days there came to an end in 1947 when he was sent to the prestigious and formidable Melbourne Grammar School. Melbourne grammar was a world of harsh discipline, cold showers, stiff uniforms, and compulsory sports. This was not the place for Barry Humphries, and he hated nearly everything about it. He took what refuge he could in reading and art. The rigorous school did give Barry some valuable training for his future. He donned skirt and stocking for a number of female roles in school plays. One review declared, for moments at a time, his true sex was forgotten. As Barry entered adolescence, he began to rebel. In protest to the school's maxim, long hair is dirty hair, Humphries let his hair grow long. He told his parents he wanted to be a painter. Before long, his relationship with them began to suffer.
Barry, during his growing up years, had said, I want to be an artist. That filled them with horror. I think Mum was worried about Barry in later years. He was not behaving as she'd expected, and he grew his hair long, and that seemed to worry her tremendously.
My mother's disapproval of so much that I did really upset me. To say that it upset me is to express my response too lightly. It was shattering not to please one's parents, parents who had been so pleased with one in childhood, to become so disappointed and disillusioned with one's late adolescence.
Humphries was into full-out subversion of the status quo by the time he entered the University of Melbourne in 1951. He had read about and admired the outrageous art movements of the early 20th century.
The ones who amused me the most were the Dadaists, who did absolutely horrific things to shock people. I thought of myself as a reincarnation of these Dadaists, and I invented all kinds of stunts to shock the university students because they were a terribly respectable lot.
Humphries and his friends formed a Dada group and amused themselves writing and recording their own Dada sketches.
Gentle listener, you are about to hear, through the medium of the gramophone record, something of the prose, the poesy, the drama, and the music of the Wabbo movement.
Humphries went a step further when he mounted 2 exhibitions of Dada art, featuring his own original works. He set out to stir up what he considered to be the oppressively Philistine city of Melbourne, and he succeeded.
One of the exhibits was called Old Melburnians. The Old Melburnians were noted for their consumption of alcohol, and so there was a beer bottle with an old Melbourne grammar tie around it, and this incensed the president of the Old Melburnian Society.
This is like turning life into theater for him, turning the boredom of life into a kind of playfield where he is the master puppeteer. He wants to disabuse people of their received opinions and their received emotions, and he wants to put emotion into people to make somebody feel real disgust or fear. That's exciting to Barry.
By the end of his second year at the University of Melbourne, Humphries was spending more time outside of class than in. In 1953, he dropped out. He had completed no courses, but he'd created a legend.
I succeeded in really offending a large number of people at the university, and finally I left. I failed all my exams when everyone thought I was going to pass them with flying colors. I'd been hailed as brilliant when I came to the university, and I was farewelled a dunce.
Barry further shocked his parents in October of 1955 when he suddenly announced he was getting married to a young actress and dancer named Brenda Wright.
It seemed to me, of course, that it was a romantic impulse on my part. But of course it was also an attempt to escape from home. After all, that was a legitimate way to leave home, wasn't it? I'd love to live at home for the rest of my life, dear mother and father, but I'm getting married.
My parents were very disappointed, really. Not a lot was said. I don't think I was very happy about it. My mother certainly wasn't, and she developed a headache and stayed home. Didn't go to the wedding.
Just 21 and newly married, Barry Humphries was finally out of his parents' house. But he was far from forgetting the world they inhabited. In fact, he was about to create a character that would avenge that world for years to come. In 1955, he joined the Union Theatre Repertory Company. Playing the lovesick Duke Orsino in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, Humphries toured with the troupe, making one-night stands in small Australian towns.
At the end of the performance, the local culture vulture would make a nice speech. She would wear a hat, gloves, a pretty dress. There would be a table covered with food for the actors, and she would thank us for bringing culture to their town. And she would make such a nice speech, and we'd be snorting with laughter behind our hands as we listened to her. And I used to entertain the rest of our company with my impersonation of these women, and they seemed to be all the same.
These little impersonations were the birth of the woman everyone would come to know. And by the end of the run, Humphries had fashioned her an average Australian housewife named Edna Everidge. She was shy, she was dowdy, and she was nothing like a dame. In one early skit, she offered to open her home to immigrants coming into Australia.
Ask her if she'd like a New Zealander.
Hello, dear. The gentleman here has just suggested a New Zealander. I believe they're a very clean type of person. What, dear? A tattoo.
And he went through them one after the other, and she made the most racist and vitriolic comments about each of the nations that were being offered to her, and eventually decided she'd have none of them.
Once again, Humphries was out to shock in his entertaining. Edna Everidge was his revenge against what he saw as the narrow-mindedness of an insular white middle class.
Underneath Barry's work then, there was tremendous anger. So Mrs. Everidge, which is Mrs. Average, and average means mediocre, and also means carping and arrogant in your ignorance so that you don't respect things that you don't understand.
One of Edna's hallmarks was the detail in which she described her home and furnishings, noting the duck egg blue walls and glass double doors with sand-blasted reindeers. Some saw her as a revenge against Humphries' own middle-class upbringing, and against his mother in particular.
I don't see that Barry drew on my mother, but some of Edna's attitudes, the attitudes to hygiene and good behaviour, perhaps may have been gathered from the family. Certain things like sponge fingers, that we never had things that we considered bad taste, like burgundy Axminster carpets.
Humphries had tapped into a natural talent, characterizations. Over the next few years, he would create other markedly Australian characters, including Sandy Stone, a war veteran who spends his days reminiscing.
He's somebody who's settled for very little, next to nothing, who is determined to have an easy life, who doesn't wait to see the end of the movie because he'd like to get home before the traffic.
Got my hands pretty full at work at the moment, and the garden gets very thirsty this time of year. The last Thursday was an absolute scorcher.
Humphries' characters had broken new ground. In using people from his own backyard, Humphries had created Australian humor.
It was a matter of Barry entertaining himself and thereby others, and making Australia, as a friend of mine once said, a funny place.
Barry was one of the first comedians to make fun of Australia, or really it was the suburban outlook, I think, more than anything. That rather narrow, confined attitude.
Humphries' colourful personality and comic impersonations made him a local celebrity in Melbourne, but not all was well at home. He and his wife Brenda separated after just 1 year. Then at a party in 1958, he met a ballet dancer named Rosalind Tong. She was on her way to join the Danish Ballet Company. She never made it.
They ended up together, she fell in love, and she says that he was a brilliant mind and a lot of fun. So I think she fell for him straight away.
Barry and Rosalind married in the spring of 1959, and at 25, Humphries now felt ready to take his characters beyond Australia. In June, he and Rosalind set sail for England, ready to conquer London. You are watching Outrageous Performers Week on Biography.
Check it out.
The next generation Chrysler Town and Country.
You do that? I thought you did. Let's get out of here.
With power sliding doors and liftgate with an obstacle detection system. Drive one and see why it's the best minivan ever. Now get a $2,000 cash allowance or 0.9% APR financing on Chrysler Town and Country.
Holy moly! What's in the truck?
It's kind of hard to explain.
Open it up.
Delphi may be new to some people, but we've been around, developing advanced technologies that use electronics to replace mechanical systems and creating new energy solutions for the vehicles of tomorrow. Delphi Automotive Systems, driving tomorrow's technology.
Well, it's nice to see you all. It really, really is. Isn't it, honey?
Oh, yes. We must do this more often.
Thanks for coming.
Where will you find the money to pay for long-term care? Conseco long-term care insurance protects you so you don't lose your nest egg. Conseco, step up.
Thursday nights are chilly nights at Ladder Company 55. And when it's Wachowski's turn, it's a 5-alarmer. That means heartburn and gas. These don't have the medicine to relieve both, but now there's new Gas X with Maalox, combining the proven heartburn relief of Maalox with the most powerful gas-fighting medicine around to relieve heartburn and gas fast. New Gas X with Maalox beats the burn and the bloat fast.
Hi, Mr. and Mrs. Miller.
How's the vacation planning going, Dad? Great.
Just the two of us. No kids, no house, no worries.
Change your search without using the back button. Another way Expedia makes it easy to find the trip you're looking for.
Ladies and gentlemen, Expedia.com.
An American musical icon, a legendary live performer, coming to A&E. Neil Diamond, live by request, Saturday, July 28th on A&E.
You are watching Dame Edna, part of Outrageous Performers Week on Biography. In June 1959, Barry Humphries, now 25 and newly remarried, arrived in London, ready to make a name for himself. But his first year abroad was not what he had hoped it would be.
The transition coming from Melbourne to London was hard because there were lots of people who were being very clever and intelligent and who were well-read and able to do the kinds of things that he aspired to do and was doing. But in Australia, he was a solitary figure.
Then, after more than a year with little acting work, Humphries won the part of Mr. Sowerberry, the Undertaker, in a new musical, Oliver, by Lionel Bart. Bart was so impressed with Humphries' audition, he wrote a song especially for him, That's Your Funeral.
That's your funeral, not our funeral, that's your funeral.
Oliver was a big hit, and things were looking up for Barry Humphries. Money was coming in, and he was firmly established as a working actor in London. Then Humphries got a call that would change everything. A Melbourne producer suggested he put together a one-man show featuring his many characters, including Edna Everage and Sandy Stone. A Nice Night's Entertainment opened at the Assembly Hall in Melbourne in 1962. The show was a success. In it, Humphries brought out a number of characters, but by the time he finished touring Australia, it was Edna Everage everyone knew.
Oh, isn't this mad? Look, I'm that nervous. I've only addressed branch meetings of the Housewives Association before. Mind you, television's marvellous, isn't it? It's such a lovely piece of furniture.
Back in London, Humphries got the chance to try his one-man show at The Establishment, a very fashionable venue in Soho. It was the break Barry had dreamed of. In the spring of 1963, he opened at the club and quickly bombed.
I was a terrible failure. People didn't want to hear about Australian characters. They wanted to hear about British politics. My stuff just seemed terribly regional, and I didn't feel funny. And you know, to be a comedian, you have to feel funny, which requires confidence. And that takes a bit of building up. You know, pills don't do it, really.
Humphries struggled with what he's described as gloom and self-reproach. But soon there was another event to divert his attention: fatherhood. On May 14, 1963, Rosalind gave birth to a daughter, Tessa. Humphries' career took another turn in 1964. He was asked to write a comic strip for the satiric magazine Private Eye. Barry Mackenzie featured a young, naive Australian of the same name, newly arrived in London.
He was mainly notable for these extraordinary expressions, mostly to do with vomiting and urinating and other bodily functions. Pretty well all of them he made up himself, shaking hands with a wife's best friend.